Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's so good and truly heartening to see all of you this afternoon, this rainy afternoon, coming out to celebrate and commemorate the phenomenal life and legacy of Malcolm X, also known as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. Where do we begin? I want to offer thanks, first of all, to our amazing staff here in the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell, including Treva Levine, Erin O'Keefe, and especially for this outstanding Malcolm X programming, Hannah Langtree, who has contributed so much to the development and success of our programming so far, and who I'm sad to say will be leaving the Africana Studies and Research Center as far as her role as our graduate field coordinator and event planner, but definitely not our community, which will always be home. But thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Hannah, for your outstanding. I also want to shout out Dr. Leonard Jeffries and his wife, Dr. Rosalind, the beautiful Queen Mother. It's so easy to forget and to take for granted their contributions to commemorating Malcolm X over the years. I want to say, uh, before it became cool. I mean, they, at a steady pace, sustained the tributes. They were among the people who sustained tributes over time. I got an opportunity to meet them in person 5 years ago at the Making History conference in honor of our founding director, Dr. James Turner, and so they offered the last words at that event. I think it's just important to mention them now because it's so easy for the contributions of such figures to get lost. But for the friends that they've been to the Africana Studies and Research Center and to Malcolm X, I just want to acknowledge them especially, and to all of the people who have over time commemorated his life and legacy in various ways. And so many thanks to figures like them, and to underscore that they're by no means forgotten. So this is part two of a two-part series that we incorporated within our programming this year to reflect on Malcolm X as a community. And as before, what we really want to do is to provide a safe and welcoming space for that purpose. And so it's so good to see all of you who have come out this afternoon for what I think will be truly a treat. And so our program and format was set, I think, again, last June as we honored Dr. Turner's legacy when I heard Professor Margaret Washington speak. And there were certain remarks that she made that let me know that she somehow needed to be a part of this. And more broadly, one of our goals has been to focus on the experts right within our community and alumni who have produced writing and research related to Malcolm X. So here we are. One of the things that's really interesting, especially I think to consider in a moment like this, takes me back to Ossie Davis's eulogy, in which he famously uh, described Malcolm X as our black and shining prince. And so much of the dialogue about Malcolm X in the wake of his loss reflected on his youth, that he was framed as one of those leaders, one of those figures gone too soon, like Patrice Lumumba. And eventually there would be Dr. King, Fred Hampton, and Mark Clark. So many extraordinary figures who've been taken and who had extraordinary visions. One can only imagine what kind of world we might have right now had they been allowed to fully carry out the ideals that they were represented in all the various cases. The other thing is that Malcolm X was so frequently um, connected to young audiences, even during his lifetime. In fact, days before he passed away, he was in Selma dialoguing with a group of youth in my home state, Alabama. And that's a famous moment. And it's also been the basis of the development of one of the volumes about him. Malcolm X talks to young people. So he was always talking to young people. He was profoundly influential in the life of Sonia Sanchez, in the life of Amiri Baraka. In fact, for the rest of Amiri Baraka's life, he had that reckoning with Malcolm X. And so many of us have had to have our reckoning with Malcolm X, in various ways. And then one thing, too, is that even in the wake of his tragic loss, he continued to be profoundly influential in the years thereafter, particularly in helping to catalyze the Black Power movement more broadly, also in influencing the development of the Black Panther Party, and most notably, their philosophy of self-defense. And it's just gone on and on and on. But the reality is that there's not been a time since he passed away that Malcolm X has not been perceived as being relevant to Black cultural discourses and dialogues. But given that so often he was described, he was lionized as that young person, lost at age 39, we have to ask ourselves, what is his continuing significance at a time when he would have literally been 100? I think it's going to take me a minute to wrap my head around that and think about what it means. But the reality is that Malcolm X continues to be so indispensable, so vital, so useful for purposes of thinking with and through. There have been many cultural productions that have been developed in his honor. We can think, for instance, of what about even just last night? In my opening remarks for our event in February, I talked about how if I could share just one thing with Malcolm X, it would be Robin D.G. Kelly's essay, The Riddle of the Zoot, because Malcolm X, as a young man, wore zoot suits, and he tended to dismiss that attire and that whole phase as kind of a deviation on his path. But Robin D.G. Kelly has given us another way to think about him. And I think last night, with the Met and the paean to the dandy and, incorporating zoot suit culture is probably one of the most interesting tributes that could be happening even in the space of New York for him right now. And thinking about the totality of who he was as a person makes it all the more provocative to look at. But over the years we've seen multiple filmic tributes to him, and all of us, we could even talk about the Malcolm X films alone, thinking about all of the extraordinary actors who have embodied him over the years, including figures like Denzel Washington in Spike Lee's famous film, or more recently Kingsley Ben-Adir. I'm ever fascinated by the representations of him that we see in culture. Bill Scott and his wife Rachel, and Bill is a young white scholar whom I met as a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, literally named their son after Malcolm X. And so these are even the tributes that kind of have played out in culture over time. I remember that in scrolling in social media, you see the young white boy wearing glasses and, in the gray suit. And even for everyone looking at it, it's obvious that he's paying tribute to Malcolm X, and most notably without donning all of the, you can be white and signal Malcolm X and perform who he was. And I think that even that, portrait that we've seen circulating in social media is very relevant. but all of these popular tributes that we've seen to Malcolm X that have raised questions, and then, moments along the way, like the release of a postage stamp in his honor in 1999, and the paeans to him even in his hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. And so I think my curiosity at this point is, what would Malcolm X think about these tributes? I think that he would be fascinated by them, if not amused on some levels, but also perhaps troubled to a certain extent because he is embraced even across a broad political spectrum, including by some conservatives like Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. So the question becomes, why is he so relatable? And even how do those engagements, those appropriations obscure in some ways his message and distort even aspects of what he represented? Even though, as a researcher, I'm convinced myself and very persuaded that monuments matter, so they have their place too, I think, in advancing certain cultural discourses and dialogues, but those representations are also more complicated. So as I said, in our programming here in recent times, what we wanted to do in reflecting on Malcolm X is to rely on the experts. And so in the spring, Jared Ball so eloquently presented and had a dialogue with our esteemed historian, Dr. Margaret Washington. So he had what I consider to be the hard part in terms of thinking about and reflecting on Malcolm X's loss. The challenge before us today is to reflect on his life. I could not be more pleased with how the program in the spring turned out and how much it was anchored by our students, our graduate students, especially journalists, including Amanla Thomas Johnson, Mamadou Tao at Telluride. I think is significant. Malcolm X famously visited Telluride and so has visited Cornell's campus. And so we wanted to be sure to even acknowledge that previous history, and that event came off beautifully. Another thing that was important here in the Africana institution was for time to stop. So right in this very room and in the hour of the assassination, we had a silent moment. Here today, we are gathered again to reflect on his truly just epic life, as brief as it was. And one of our thoughts was to invite Professor Russell Rickford to this time around dialogue with Professor Margaret Washington. Even before Professor Rickford joined Cornell's faculty, he wrote a truly just stunning and epic biography of Dr. Betty Shabazz, cover to cover. It is utterly captivating, it's very brilliant, and I think it reflects a deep dive into not only the history of Dr. Betty Shabazz, but the legacy of the Shabazz family and Malcolm X more broadly. So it's one reason that I thought it would be useful, particularly to kind of take that part as far as reflecting on Malcolm X's life. And so that's what we're aiming to do today. And I think we're charged and challenged to think about Malcolm X, not only in terms, like I've acknowledged in my own comments here, the cultural kind of fascination with him, the continuing relevance that we can speak of, but let's think about him, especially within the midst of just our world right now. Like, what could we learn from him? How could he help us to think about that? So in keeping with our structure before, the final thing that I want to do before I, before I turn it over, and after reading these biographies, is to hear from our dear Dean Janice Turner as far as the centennial birthday of him, of Malcolm X, so that we get a sense of, again, that very visceral kind of relationship that Malcolm X had with our founding family here at Africana, the Turner family. And then we'll go right to Professor Margaret Washington so that she can begin to pitch her questions to Professor Rickford. So that's roughly how we'll proceed. So hold on. Margaret Washington joined the Cornell History Department in 1988 as an associate professor. She was also a member of the Africana Studies graduate field. Her specialties are African American history and culture and African American women. Margaret Washington is also a specialist in Southern history and has written extensively on the Galah people of South Carolina. She is one of the foremost authorities on the Black experience. Washington's awards include the Alice H. Cook and Constance E. Cook Award, Cornell University, Center for Humanities Senior Fellow Award, Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut, National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship for University Teachers, Society for the Humanities Faculty Fellow, Cornell University, and the Sierra Prize for a Peculiar People from the West Coast Association of Women's Historians. Washington is dedicated to professional activism outside of the university and committed to public history. She is a frequent lecturer and panel participant at high schools, summer institutes, museums, the Park Service, and local libraries. She also served on the New York State Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities Media Panels. Russell Rickford is an American scholar and activist who is an associate professor in the Department of History at Cornell. Russell Rickford is also a member of the Africana Studies graduate field. Russell Rickford's research and teaching focuses on the Black radical tradition, transnational social movements, and on Black liberal culture after World War II. His book, We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination, received the 2016 Hooks Institute National Book Award and the 2017 OAH Liberty Legacy Foundation Award. He is currently working on a book about Guyana and African American radical politics in the 1970s. Russell Rickford has written the only in-depth biography on Betty Shabazz, the wife of Malcolm X. So, Dr. Turner?
I didn't know I was supposed to do this. No, it's difficult because Malcolm befriended Dr. Turner and I when we were young, getting ready to go away to college, and we always went to the restaurant. And he came up to us and he said, I see you in here all the time. You look alike, but you're too close. You're too close to be sister and brother. So then we talked, and we told him where we were going, and he was kind enough, got us a map, because we were going to Central Michigan, which was in Mount Pleasant, and I forgot how far from Grand Rapids, where he grew up, where he was, and his family. So he told us where we were going, because we didn't know, and got his brother to meet us in Lansing, Michigan, to get us on another bus to get to Mount Pleasant. James and him corresponded while we were there. James and my brother hitchhiked when he was going to speak at Grand Rapids. And it was a terrible time when the young man, there was only 40 African Americans on campus out of about 9,000 students. And when the young man, James, his name was James, came to and banged on the door and started crying to say what had happened to Malcolm. It was really a devastating thing. And so we were the only ones with an apartment, so everybody came. But James and Malcolm were closer, and with Betty, but he was just a very special person and was very special to us.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Dean Turner, for your perspectives, for your memories, which we cherish, and they mean so much, and are memories and reflections and insights from which we can learn. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to our main speakers. Thank you.
You want to go first? Or?
Sure.
I mean, I'll go first.
Sure.
I don't mind.
Sure.
Well, how long should we talk?
How long?
Yeah, how?
Well, we should probably move toward we should try and say some introductory things, and we should try and probably move towards some.
We
some
want a
audience interaction.
conversation,
Yes.
rather than a pontification.
I
So-
know you're gonna get some of that.
Well, you can get that through the conversation. So it's really an honor to be doing this in commemoration and recognition of, I think, one of Black America's greatest representatives of the Black experience and one of our greatest heroes. As an 18th and 19th century historian, I place Malcolm X in the category of other great freedom fighters in the pre-modern era: Frederick Douglass, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture, David Walker, Nat Turner, Henry Highland Garnet, Antonio Maceo. And in the modern era of the last century, he's obviously right up there with people like Martin Luther King, Patrice Lumumba, Steve Biko, people who were struck down by the international power structure of which our nation is one, and as was Malcolm X. So the legacy of Malcolm X keeps company with many great men, and I should say parenthetically women, in the modern and the pre-modern era. You can't forget Marcus Garvey, you can't forget W.B. Du Bois, all of whom embraced African American nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and the plight of oppressed people all over the globe. It was not just a struggle for Black America, it was a struggle of oppressed people, most of whom were people of color, but not all. And every one of these leaders recognized the solidarity of humanity. And I think that's very important to remember, that this goes beyond color. And that's something that Malcolm came to terms with as he evolved away from the Nation of Islam. So I think it's important that we recognize that. But I think that we should also keep in mind what creates this oppression. And to my view, it is the accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. And to my view, race matters. So I want to start by talking about the 19th century. This particular quote: "A Black man has no rights which a white man is bound to respect." End of quote. Those are the words of Roger B. Taney in 1857 in the Dred Scott decision. Taney was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And I want to mention this a little bit because it speaks to what was so prominent in Malcolm's later years that he focused on, and that was American hypocrisy. So Dred Scott was an enslaved man who was suing for his freedom because he had moved from the state of Missouri to a free state. And states that had no slavery, you could not bring slaves into them. So the abolitionists were suing that Scott should have his freedom. And Taney wrote the decision. And in the present work that I'm writing, I looked at the entire Dred Scott decision, and it is the most amazing piece of white supremacy that you could ever encounter. Taney draws, and it's historical. I mean, he's obviously was a very well-read man, because he goes back into the history of African slavery: the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Danes, the Belgians. The idea of a free Black man is a folly, he says, and that's a quote, folly. The Negroes brought here a Negro slave, he says, a subordinate being in a different and subordinate position, harmonizing with his essential nature and the wants and welfare of the superior race. The white man is the superior, the Negro is the inferior, and in juxtaposition, society could only exist and can only exist by placing them, the white and the black, in natural relation to each other, or by the social subordination or the so-called slavery of the Negro. And he goes on, but I won't. It's an enormously long document, and it is not, shall we say, rescinded until the 14th Amendment. And so, as I'm sure you all know, the 14th Amendment is now under attack because the 14th Amendment was meant to dissolve the Dred Scott decision so that anyone born in the United States isn't automatically a citizen. And so the move now is to remove the 14th Amendment. So black people had the right to citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Both of those have been and continue to be under assault. And Malcolm was an unlikely person to challenge this. He became a great man, but he didn't start that way, as many of us know. The son of a Baptist minister, which probably is where he got his incredible orality from. But his father was also a follower of Marcus Garvey, which of course would have informed his politics. And his mother, which also speaks to the diaspora, or as some people like to call it, the Black Atlantic, which I don't like that term, but his mother was from Grenada. And one of the things that Malcolm talked about, he was asked this in Ghana, when he came to speak in Ghana. And someone in the audience, there was a Q&A, wanted to ask this question, but didn't quite know how. And finally, he said, well, you can ask me whatever you want. And she said, Martin Malcolm, as you know, was fair-skinned, and he had red hair. And her question had to do with, you don't even look like us. You're not really black. And he went into a long litany, but one of the things he pointed out was that his mother was fair, and he had the complexion of his mother. And then he talked about rape, and made a comment about American hypocrisy, which again speaks to the earlier statement of Roger Taney and how Malcolm wanted his audiences and the world to see the hypocrisy of the United States of America. So that's how I sort of wanted to introduce. And then I wanted to say a couple of things about Malcolm and the nation and how he got to be where he was. He was an unlikely figure of greatness, as I said, and his father was killed when he was a boy. He was the youngest, and reportedly by the Klan. He was tied to a railroad track and the train ran over him. His mother tried to hold it together with a bunch of kids by herself, but she couldn't. And so Malcolm went from pillar to post and finally ended up with his sister in Boston. And as he points out, was a street hustler and everything else, and ended up in prison. And that brings up, to my view, the significance of the prison industrial complex in terms of radicalizing, especially black men. Because that's where Malcolm had the time to read, had the time to reflect, met other men who were reading and reflecting, and of course it's where he met Elijah Muhammad and was, I guess you might say, he embraced, or another way of saying it, was sucked in to the Nation of Islam. But it was an opening for him. and enrichment. And it's because of that prison experience that we have Malcolm X. And that's important not only because of Malcolm X, but also because of many other black leaders who have come out of prison, out of the prison situation. It gives them a chance to read, it gives them a chance to think, and I think, for example, of the great George Jackson, and what being in prison meant to him. Of course, he was killed in prison. And a lot of these men don't come out, but some of them do, and become important in their communities and in the struggle. And so the prison becomes like a form of education. And Malcolm took full advantage of that. And we have him as he developed because of that. The other thing I wanted to point out is Malcolm's relationship with young people. And as Dean Turner talked about Malcolm and Dr. Turner, her husband, Dr. James Turner, I reflected on the fact that, as I mentioned when we had our big Black alum commemoration for Dr. Turner, that when the seminar room was dedicated to him, he talked about his relationship with Malcolm X and how Malcolm sort of ushered him into Michigan when he and his young wife and child were going there to, Dr. Turner was going there to go to school. And I reflected on that as James was talking about this relationship, and also he mentioned parenthetically that when he came to Cornell, his family got a lot of death threats, and his children had to be taken to school in police cars. And that was his experience. And what Turner did with the Africana Center, which has a lot to do with Malcolm, is he created a center that was diasporic in terms not only of its offerings, its course offerings, but naturally its faculty. And that was a vision that Malcolm X had, that these programs, departments, which is Africana was a department, one of the few African American studies units on these campuses that actually was its own entity. Most of them were controlled by the administration, as unfortunately this one is now. But Turner's vision was to have autonomy, and he created that autonomy. And within that autonomy, he created a kind of international center. Some of the names, Dr. Ben Joachim, Congress Mbata, not just James Turner or Robert Harris or William Cross. So he created sort of an African ambiance. And it was like Malcolm personified, because after Malcolm broke with the Nation of Islam and moved on, not only politically, but religiously as well, and wanted to really examine Islam, and he went to Mecca and met Muslims who were blue-eyed, blonde, black, every color. And Malcolm was a segregationist, as you know. He began as with the Nation as a segregationist. There's a fascinating TV program, I think it was in October of 1963, where he's being interviewed, and it's interesting because this is October 1963. Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963, and that's the beginning of the break with the Nation of Islam. But at this particular point, like a month and a half before that, Malcolm is being interviewed, and he says, we want total separation. We don't think the races should live together. We want our own land in the United States. He's totally opposed to integration and anything on that scale. So this is Malcolm in October of 1963. After he makes the comment about Kennedy, after the assassination, chickens coming home to roost, Elijah Muhammad uses that because that's not really why he was put on leave and then ultimately dismissed. But he uses that to put him on leave. It's actually much deeper than that. But I want that. We can talk about that in our conversation. So Malcolm is breaking with the Nation of Islam at that point, and at this point, he's going to learn about Islam. He's also going to embrace, for want of a better term, I'll just call it Africanity. He goes to Mecca. He goes other places. He isn't allowed to go to France. He's stopped at the airport. But he also goes to African countries, and as many of you know, not many, but a few of the African countries are getting rid of colonialism. One of the most important and the first is Ghana. And he goes to Ghana, and Maya Angelou has a wonderful book called All God's Children Got Traveling Shoes, and it's about the expatriates, she's one of them, who go to Ghana and with the idea of staying there. And Malcolm comes to visit. Many people from New York are there, including the very prominent African-American writer Julian Mayfield. And Mayfield and Malcolm know each other very well. So Mayfield is going to try and get a meeting with the president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, and which doesn't happen in that visit anyway. But Malcolm explains to the people, his cohort, his African American cohort, that what he wants to do is he wants to bring the United States before the United Nations, and for their hypocrisy. And he goes into a long litany of why he wants to do this. They're very worried about this, but at the same time, they're very supportive. And they make all kinds of arrangements for Malcolm to make speeches there. And it, I think, is one of the openings that creates the sense when Malcolm begins to talk to young people that when we set up these programs like Africana Studies, that they are diasporic and not just African American. And it's, to me, it's the opening of Black Americans, Black Americans in this country, seeing that this struggle is not just a struggle for civil rights, it's a struggle for human rights. And we get that perspective from Malcolm. And this is what he's going to take to the UN when he is assassinated. And I'll say this and then I'll quit. I have a lot to say, but I won't. When he is finishing his autobiography with Alex Haley, and he's being harassed, all kinds of things are happening. They're shooting into his home. They burn him out of his house with his little children in the house, his pregnant wife. But he claims that the obvious culprit is the Nation of Islam. And he tells Haley, this is not the nation. I train the fruit of Islam. I know what they can do and what they can't do. This is bigger than the nation. And the word on the street, as we say, is that the United States government was behind the assassination of Malcolm X. That's all.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the organizers, and I want to especially acknowledge the staff of Africana once again. Thank you to Rashay. Thank you to Dean Turner. The Turner family was very important to Malcolm's family, to Dr. Shabazz, and to keeping Malcolm's legacy alive, and also to creating a space that really exemplifies the internationalism that he embodied, as Dr. Washington mentioned. Thank you to Dr. Margaret Washington. Dr. Washington has been a real mentor to me, has been a real mentor to many younger profs over the years. She's been a mentor to many, many grad students and undergrads. So it's a real pleasure and honor, tremendous honor. What's that? Yeah, and librarians, and many, many, many others, right? Many others. So folks in the community and et cetera. I want to also, before I begin, acknowledge the absence today of two people that have already been invoked. Dr. Washington mentioned the names of Amandla Johnson and Mamadou Tall. These are grad students. Mamadou is a grad student right here in Africana, and Amandla, even though Amandla's in literatures in English, also very close to Amandla, and so their absence is profoundly felt, and of course their absence is a result of them being cast into exile by the Trump administration as a result of their Palestinian activism, with the complicity, of course, of our own administration, right? So these two young people, not the only people who have been separated from our institution as a result of this repression, with the complicity of the Kotlikoff administration, but it's important to invoke them because their absence is profoundly felt. And we're all impoverished as a community because they're not here with us right now. And we have to keep struggling, right, to change that situation. It is wonderful to be here with you all, right in the aftermath of this sort of biblical storm. But maybe it's apropos because, you know, Marcus Garvey, the great Marcus Garvey, said, "Look for me in the whirlwind," and we damn near had a whirlwind earlier, so it's a good time to be revisiting the life of Malcolm. As Dr. Rashay said, El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, and I always thought of that as the kind of respectable title for Malcolm X. And I remember, you know, as a teenager, you know, learning that El Hajj Malik El Shabazz and being so impressed. But you'll have to forgive me that I always think of Malcolm as Brother Malcolm. And I said this to someone recently. You know, Stokely Carmichael, the great Stokely Carmichael, became Kwame Ture, and I always think of Kwame Ture as the kind of respectable name, but and with apologies to Kwame Ture, I always think about Stokely as Brother Stokely, because not out of disrespect we call people what they call themselves, but because in the African American experience, we fell in love with Stokely as Stokely. And in the African American experience, we fell in love with Brother Malcolm as Brother Malcolm. So he's always El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, but in our hearts, Brother Malcolm. I want to thank Dr. Washington as well for finally giving me, I was trying to think earlier what my theme was for today, finally giving me the theme. The theme, I think, for our conversation should be chickens coming home to roost. The chickens coming home to roost. As we revisit the life of Malcolm, 100 years on, right? This brother born in 1925. We're now 25 years, a quarter of our way through the 21st century. And how our current circumstances, what is this conjuncture, what does this current historical moment have to say about what Malcolm warned was going to be America's fate, and the chickens coming home to roost, right? And Brother Malcolm said, as an old farm boy, the chickens never made me, coming home to roost never made me sad, they made me glad, right? And that is the thing about Malcolm, as Professor Washington said, as we grapple with Malcolm, as we wrestle, as we try and reconcile, as Dr. Rashay said, with Malcolm, because there's a quality about Malcolm's persona, about his political legacy, that even though there have been, as Rashay was alluding to, there's been attempts to co-opt, there's been attempts to sanitize, right? Something about Malcolm and Malcolm's character and Malcolm's politics, Malcolm's persona, at the end of the day resists that kind of co-optation, and that's part of why he remains so important to us. So the chicken's coming home to roost. I wanted to say just a few words, and we're going to try and open up to the audience as soon as possible. I wanted just to say a few words about Malcolm and me. Me and Malcolm. I was born in 1975. I am a member of the hip hop generation, perhaps the original hip hop generation, right? So I discovered Malcolm through hip hop. And so there was a kind of a resurgence of black nationalism, late 80s and early 1990s. And that helped to bring about a kind of Malcolm X resurgence. At the center of this was Spike Lee's movie, Malcolm X, very important biopic, very flawed in many ways, but that helped to sort of reintroduce Malcolm X. As a young adolescent, trying to come to terms with white America, I think what Malcolm meant for me was a kind of model of uncompromising blackness. And I will say uncompromising black manhood. So I think that I fell in love with Malcolm, and I'm still deeply in love with Malcolm. Deeply in love with Malcolm. I fell in love with Malcolm in part because of what he seemed to symbolize for me as a young man in terms of a kind of model of manhood, and if I'm honest, a kind of charismatic macho persona, right? I fell in love with that. It gave me something to hold on to. It seemed to transcend the kind of liberal multiculturalism that surrounded me in Northern California in the late 80s and into the early 1990s. I fell in love with when Ossie Davis said famously in his eulogy, the black shining prince. I fell in love with the black shining, and I'm still deeply in love with the black shining prince, but as I've evolved, I hope, and matured somewhat, my relationship to Malcolm and his significance to me has also evolved. So rather than a black shining prince that's a kind of charismatic, figure, I see Malcolm today to me is a black shining prince in terms of his dignity, right? In terms of his dignity, and in terms of still deeply connected to his uncompromising anti-racism, his uncompromising anti-imperialism, his indictment of white supremacy, and this is important, his indictment of global white supremacy. So hence our title for today, The End of White World Supremacy. And I think it's really important, particularly in this moment, that we continue to use the phrase white supremacy, because that's a big part of the mess that we're in. And when I say we, I ain't just talking about black folks. I mean, I'm particularly talking to black folks today, right? When we're approaching the centennial of Malcolm. But I'm talking about all human beings on this planet. We have a serious white supremacy problem. And if we're not careful, it will destroy us. This is the chickens coming home to roost. When I say dignity, there's an anecdote I always tell about, and it's important. I mean, Rashea already alluded to this, how, she talked about Dr. Jeffries and others who were keeping Malcolm's memory alive when it was not popular to honor Malcolm, And it's really important because the black political establishment, they always used to say black middle class folks would cross the street when they saw Malcolm coming, So Malcolm was not a figure. I mean, Martin also was not a figure who was universally beloved at the time of his, quite the contrary, at the time of his death, but certainly not Malcolm. And so it's important to remember what Malcolm meant for the black grassroots, the black rank and file, working class and poor black folks. And I think it is to them that Malcolm will always belong, right? Primarily. Malcolm belongs to the world, but he has a special significance, a special resonance with the black grassroots. I always tell the anecdote about, I used to live on Lenox Avenue in Central Harlem, and the mosque, Mosque 16, the temple, Nation of Islam temple, when Malcolm was the minister, was right there in Central Harlem, and so Malcolm would walk up Lenox Avenue. And there would be, drunks, winos in the gutter who would get to their feet when Malcolm passed. That is dignity, right? And it's very important because we live in this age, we got a lot of black faces in high places, right? Who would aspire to embody dignity, that kind of regalness, but it was Malcolm who meant so much to the grassroots that people in the gutter could not remain in the gutter when he passed, right? That is someone who's not in service of empire. That is someone who's not in service of American nationalism. That is someone who belongs to us, right? The barefoot folks, the wretched of the earth, right? And that is Malcolm's significance. So I've gone from sort of my sort of romantic, okay, it's still, my love for Malcolm is still romantic. And it's a romantic in that he's the embodiment of what I wish to become and what I will never achieve, but I will never stop trying. But I have gained more respect for him as a black shining prince, not as a kind of hagiography, but in terms of his commitment to self-criticism and self-conquest. And his deep humility and his ability to say, I was wrong, right? Which is what he said to Lorraine Hansberry, the great Lorraine Hansberry, the great playwright, right? Because Malcolm was fiery. Malcolm would be talking about Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry at the time, her partner was a white man. And so I think they were at a party together, and she said, Brother Malcolm, I appreciate some of the things you say, but the way you talk about me, because I'm in an interracial relationship, it's like you are writing me out of the family, and that's not right. That's not brotherly. And Malcolm said, you're right, I'm sorry, right? So I say that to say Malcolm had a profound commitment to truth. He was always seeking truth. And he would not let any petty doctrine or dogma or even previous statements, right, divert him from the truth. And so that's a tremendous example of personal example, political example of dignity. Malcolm, as has already been implied, transcended a narrow black nationalism. And I don't want to deride the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam cleaned up Malcolm. Nation of Islam cleaned up generations of basically street hustlers. So I don't want to take anything away from the Nation of Islam, but the truth is that Malcolm outgrew the Nation of Islam. He outgrew the Nation of Islam. He outgrew this kind of what I call a narrow black nationalism, or even a bourgeois black nationalism, that wishes to construct a black nation, but does not fundamentally threaten the status quo, doesn't threaten the political, economic structures of racial capitalism, right? So as he drops the white devil analysis, he embraces, particularly 64, 65, he embraces a more universalist, revolutionary outlook. He begins to see anti-racism and anti-imperialism as struggles that belong to all of the oppressed and colonized people of the world. And as has already been suggested, he also begins to transcend patriarchy, right? Again, profound self-criticism. He comes out of one of the most, patriarchal organizations, the Nation of Islam. The women have to separate auxiliaries, et cetera, et cetera. Right, women have to submit to men, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to overstate this, because there's a way in which when people are martyred, we can see the end point of their life as the end point of their development. But of course, the assassination is an intrusion in Malcolm's ongoing evolution, right? But certainly we know that he was committed to working with some of the most powerful women, including Maya Angelou, including people like, and I wrote these down so I wouldn't forget, Ella Collins, his sister, Vicki Garvin, Sarah Mitchell, Lynn Shiflett, Yuri Kuchiyama, Gloria Richardson, he wanted to make some of these women very central to this organization of Afro-American unity. So and he was getting a lot of heat too from the brothers, right? Especially the brothers that came out of the nation. So how are you going to let a woman run this organization, right? So he was engaged in a process of self-criticism. Okay, let me just say one or two more things about internationalism, and then we'll try and have a broader conversation. In this moment, when we think about the post-civil rights era, if we think about the late 20th century and early 21st century, how can Malcolm's politics and Malcolm's persona help us critique, address, and transcend some of the crises of our time? I mean, before Trumpism sort of changed the game, there was, I think, a broad consensus within the American political establishment, right? Democrat or Republican, didn't matter necessarily what administration was in office. There was a kind of veneer of a pretext of commitment to racial equality. Okay, and that is in large part a testament to the power of the Black freedom struggle, the post-war Black freedom struggle, the civil rights movement. You were going to say?
Oh, no, I can wait.
Okay, okay. I think that Malcolm plays a critical role in helping us to understand how thin that apparent consensus on the question of racial equality, on the question of racial harmony, really was. So there's a kind of a self-congratulatory discourse, right? This is the sort of civil rights movement as the embodiment of the American creed, right? As the embodiment of American exceptionalism, as the unfolding of a kind of inherent liberty that lies within our society, right? That lies within our democracy. In other words, the story of the civil rights movement and the story of Black people's inclusion into the American mainstream becomes an alibi for American nationalism. And indeed, it becomes an alibi for American empire. And the sort of ultimate embodiment of that is the election of Obama. And no one articulates the idea of the sort of triumphant story of the civil rights movement ushering African Americans into the mainstream. No one articulates that more profoundly, more powerfully than Obama. I think it's a profoundly dangerous narrative. And it's a narrative that I think has been used to lull us to sleep. I think BLM in the last several years did a great deal of work to wake us back up, right? To wake us back up under liberal presidents, and also to help direct a kind of grassroots resistance under conservative and then reactionary presidents as well. Part of the significance, a big part of the significance of Malcolm is the psychological liberation from white supremacy, or what was known at the time as Black consciousness. An attempt to transcend the complex of the colonized, Wationgo called it decolonize the mind, the rejection of the term Negro, the adoption of alternative terms like Afro-American and ultimately Black, but a part of a larger quest to remake Black identity. And Professor Washington mentioned even the naming of Africana, I think, is very much part of the legacy of Malcolm, not Negro studies, and not even African American studies, but thinking about in a kind of diasporic and in a Pan-African frame. The last thing I'll mention is Malcolm as a way of recognizing and transcending the contradictions of liberal reform. Certainly, there is a I think the black rank and file, the grassroots, that there's a commitment to social equality, there's a commitment to full participation. People recognize segregation as a central edifice of oppression. So there's a commitment to desegregation, to full participation. But liberal integrationism, right? No one articulated the shortcomings of kind of liberal reform and liberal integrationism more powerfully than did Malcolm. And Malcolm really helped us understand that the quest for mere inclusion into white society was at odds with the goals of genuine power and liberation, right? Nobody articulated that more powerfully than Malcolm X. The kind of lingering recognition that we live in the belly of the beast, that we have a special duty to struggle against imperialism from the inside, right? That's part of our duty, right, as people of conscience, to reject American exceptionalism, to recognize this as a settler colony, and to reject the terms of white supremacy. And I think this is in part what Cedric Robinson was getting at when he talked about the black radical tradition. And I see Malcolm as the sort of one of the most important exemplars of a black radical tradition, which is to say the black grassroots, through our experience of captivity and oppression, rejecting the terms of the dominant order, right? And seeking social alternatives, right? So therefore, we demand full participation, but we also practice we demand full citizenship, but we also practice a kind of counter-citizenship, right? We recognize U.S. imperialism. We recognize the United States and its role in a kind of neo-colonial order, let's say post-World War II, a kind of hidden empire. And we insist on creating alternatives along with other oppressed people around the world. So there's other things we can say about Malcolm's internationalism in particular, but I think we're probably approaching the time we should open up the conversation. And forgive me, I asked Sister Rasheda to turn down the AC a bit, but maybe it's getting a little warm in here again. Maybe we can find a comfortable medium. I don't know.
Oh, can we,
That's not a bad idea.
Can we pass the microphone around? We can.
Sure.
Thank you all so much. This has truly been, I think, a very revealing and insightful discussion, and also an inspiring one. As I think about it and process it, so one of the thoughts that came to mind had to do with what Malcolm X famously said about nations in the world, wherever he went, where the women were, as he put it, like behind, then it's like, so we're because women teach children, and they have such a primary role to play in children's lives, that if women are not educated, then the nation is also somehow one that suffers from a lack of development. And so that was one of the takeaways from a lot of the travels that he did. I am also thinking about I want to register that we are definitely in a very different time with many more resources and possibilities for learning about Malcolm X than ever have existed in the past. And I say that as far as even technology, like as someone who's from Generation X, I have to acknowledge it used to be hard out there as far as gaining access even to resources like Malcolm X's speeches if one was not in those circles. And I remember what it was like as an 18-year-old college student, having the tapes, sitting in my dorm room with, friends, like listening to Malcolm X tapes, and everyone was precious. But nowadays we have so much at our disposal, and there's so much that can be taken for granted in some cases than ever before. So the bottom line is not to take anything for granted, and to use those resources to really seriously reflect on the legacy. With the program back in February, one of the intriguing things was that both our librarian, Mr. Kofi Akri, and I came up with different archives related to Malcolm X's speeches, and what the common denominator was across the board was that both of us chose links post November 1963. And so it's interesting that separately we decided to kind of think about a post nation Malcolm, because we wanted to capture that moment of autonomy and those months that he had to kind of flesh out his philosophy for the organization of African American unity on his own. In the field of Southern Studies, I must give a shout out to my colleagues in the field, because Malcolm X has been theoretically generative for fields like Southern Studies in more recent times. Throughout the new millennium, really, that one line from him where he says that the South in the United States is anywhere below the Canadian border, we've taken and run with. And I think it's been very generative for discourses like ones related to the global South. The other thing is that I think it's also anticipated some of the most innovative work within the historical field when we think about Matthew Countryman, this idea of the North being also a place where racism on the U.S. landscape can play out. So for Malcolm X, the South was not by any means the only bastion of American racism. He also indicted the North for its kind of Southern-like racism. Yes, absolutely. So
Langston Hughes.
he nailed it like that. My question to kind of start us off goes back to a point that Professor Washington made, the way that we, and I think this has come up with Professor Rickford some too, but the infrastructures that Malcolm X could take for granted, like the UN, in his time, because the goal, as we've heard, was for him to take the case of American racism and the denial of the humanity of Black Americans to the UN. So that's one thing. And I think that the other is that, and as some of his critics have said over the years, there's this kind of black-white binary in which he operated, but he was very invested in this notion of the power of transformation once people were, say, more enlightened and made more aware of the racial problem. And I think we've seen a very different kind of dynamic play out in our political culture in more recent years and times, where there's this sense that, there's been this almost insistent pattern for some people of taking sides against themselves, voting against their own interests. And it's very inimical, I think, for everyone overall, but it resists that presumption that I think that was often governed a lot of the thinking about race during the 1960s, that once people know better, they do better, because sometimes they don't. And so I just am curious about how you all respond to, how you think Malcolm X would respond to the landscape, like as far as, the collapse of some of not collapse, but just maybe the questioning of a lot of the institutions that even he took for granted, as far as thinking about possibilities for improving things for humanity, and then also like the shifting kind of terrain in the nation in terms of just racial politics, interactions, logics, that sort of thing.
That's terrific. I think that's a great question. I wonder if we could take maybe a couple, three more questions from the audience, just so we can open it up a bit, if that's okay. Margaret, you want to call on?
Oh, you want? I'll just say a couple of things. I think that in terms of what's going on in this country, like with DEI, he would say, "I told you so." That's what hypocrisy is. And as far as the UN, I think he would be surprised, but I think it would also make him more determined to make change. And maybe even infiltrating the UN, because there are many nations of color.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Washington, Dr. Rickford, for speaking with us. I greatly appreciate it. So my question, and I promise there's a question at the end of this, is, a lot of us are likely familiar with the sort of revisionist narratives about civil rights that get promoted through our education system and mass media, that are what I would call like a narrative of juxtaposition between Malcolm X and his counterpart, Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of these aspects that I'm sure are more familiar to us is this idea of, their views on nonviolence and how a lot of the idyllic romanticizations of King, position him and his perspectives on violence in a less nuanced way than is actually appropriate. But I think another dimension is this idea of internationalism and this notion of Martin Luther King being just more of a straightforward integrationist and more concerned with black people's inclusion or assimilation into the white power structure, as opposed to X emphasizing more transnational solidarity or politics of internationalism. So I guess having not read up much on this yet, but it being an area that I definitely want to delve more into, I'm curious, as people who have extensively studied X and civil rights and Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm curious, what would you say to sort of problematize those narratives, or at least frame our thinking about them in a different manner in terms of how we think about both of these individuals and the intellectual traditions that kind of stem from them, respectively?
It's a good question. Professor Washington, do you want to take another question and then we'll
Yeah,
launch him?
sure.
Okay, let's take one more. Whoever has the mics.
Okay. Quickly, my question is, maybe we would be in the world of creative work, imagining. I mentioned in one of our meetings here when we were talking about this event that Frantz Fanon would have turned 100 years also.
Yeah.
Patrice Lumumba would have turned 100 years also.
Ho Chi Minh?
The three
Some
of
the
them were
spirits,
born
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah.
So the ideas that Malcolm X was cultivating toward the end of his life, we need to go beyond the borders of the United States. The United States is structurally connected to the rest of the world, to Africa. So I have been thinking of what could have happened if all these, we're talking about these great men, but there were many more people, women, who were thinking of this transnational nature of the world and the capitalist leader of the United States. So can you really say something about what could have happened if they had not all been killed? Lumumba was killed by the CIA.
Yeah.
Frantz Fanon, the cancer, it has been now proved that it was inflicted. Yes. So that's, I have other questions, but I don't want to talk too long. And so can you lead us to what could have happened?
I think the other thing that's also important.
Speaking
is that-
in a mic, Ken, so they
Yes,
can
sir.
get it on the.
I think the other thing that's very important that you guys talked about is to go back and look at what Malcolm said. So like if you look at the book Malcolm X Speaks that was quoted, or there's another book by Les Payne, The Dead Are Arousing, Malcolm X, The FBI File, or Malcolm X Make It Plain, I believe is by William Strickland. Because one of the things, and now I understand why, Dr. Turner had told us, go back and read and look at the sources and see what Malcolm X said. So when he was in Ghana, I just realized in regard to what Dr. Lumumba had said, Patrice Lumumba had been assassinated. And it was Maya Angelou, they went into the United Nations and they protested that. And then Malcolm had talked to, I believe it was Maya Angelou.
Yeah.
When he had gotten to Ghana, the person that helped him meet, as Dr. Washington was talking about, was he met Shirley Graham Du Bois.
Yeah.
And Shirley Graham Du Bois helped him meet Kwame Nkrumah. And then from there, as he had traveled through, he had sat down and he met with various leaders. He spoke before and positioned the paper in regard to the Organization of Afro-American Unity. and it's very important that we go back. A lot of the books are in the library here, and we want you to go back and look at those books. And my question to Dr. Washington, as well as Russell Rickford, if you could talk a little bit more about the question of what was Malcolm trying to do when he spoke before the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and what was the conversations, to your understanding, in terms of a global struggle against oppression, and particularly in regard to Pan-Africanism, and what was the linkage between what was happening to Africans in America, in the United States, as well as other people? If you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Okay, that's maybe one last comment.
Thank you for hosting this. This is amazing. So given Malcolm's evolving internationalist politics and his efforts to connect the Black freedom struggle with global anti-colonial movements, how should we think about contemporary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, and what can be done academically, politically, or otherwise to protect and support such leaders who seem to challenge neo-colonial structures?
Okay, neo-colonialism. Okay. Maybe I'll try and tackle a couple of those, Professor Washington. So there's a sort of theme emerging with the questions. I'll speak to a little bit to chickens coming home to roost again. So Malcolm makes this famous comment as has been mentioned about the chickens coming home to roost in response to a question about the murder of JFK. And this actually gives Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam, the sort of excuse he needs, a pretext to sort of formally silence Malcolm, which doesn't begin, but sort of accelerates his sort of being pushed out of the Nation of Islam by late 63, early 1964. You know, Malcolm's comment about the chickens coming home to roost is actually a very layered comment. In part, he's talking about Western imperialism, and he's talking about the Congo in particular, right? He's talking about the United States and other Western imperialist nations' complicity in the assassination of Lumumba, the first democratically elected leader of the Congo, and the complicity of empire in the attempt to dismember and continue a kind of neo-colonial relationship with the Congo. When he says the chicken's coming home to roost, he's indicting Kennedy, but he's indicting the U.S. for its complicity in the assassination of Lumumba. He's also indicting the United Nations, right? Hammerstrom, right? Yeah. The leader of the UN, who also sort of participates in this effort to destabilize and kind of recapture the Congo for the imperialist powers. So Malcolm was always internationalist. Malcolm was always drawing connections between the fate of black people and those of other oppressed people around the world. Someone asked about King and Malcolm. Now, Professor Washington and I are great admirers of King and always will be. I think a legitimate critique that we can make of King is that one of the sort of internal struggles for King was how to express publicly his internationalism. Okay, I mean, King had a number of these struggles, how to express publicly his commitment to democratic socialism, which took him a while to articulate publicly. His opposition to the Vietnam War, okay, which took him a while. I mean, it was exactly a year before his death that he came out publicly against the Vietnam War, and they never stopped demonizing that man for it. You have to understand, and this is important for young people, if you are committed to human rights, if you are committed to human universalism, which is to say, none of us get written out of this family, you are on the other side of the United States government. You are a dissident, whether or not you know it. And the deeper and deeper your commitment to human rights becomes, the more you will find yourself at odds with U.S. empire. So King comes out against the Vietnam War, April 1967. Malcolm had already come out against the Vietnam War as a colonialist war.
So had SNCC.
Right? So it's SNCC, right? 66, right? Against the Vietnam War. Now, what happens to SNCC? All of their money dries up.
Yep.
Right? All of their money dries up. You can't take a stand. You know, SNCC comes out on behalf of the Palestinian people. It was clear by the 1960s, right, that Palestinian people were colonized subjects, right? And their resistance movement was an anti-colonial movement, right? SNCC comes out. Malcolm had always taken these positions. Malcolm had taken this position as early as 1964. So Malcolm really represents, more than any other figure, the revitalization of black internationalism, and particularly the revitalization of black internationalism in the heart of Cold War repression, right? When you couldn't say internationalism, when you couldn't say Pan-Africanism, are you kidding? You're subversive. You're un-American. So in some ways, an analogous moment to the very moment we find ourselves in, because you dare not say the word Palestine, right? You dare not utter that word, right? Your money will dry up. They will try and discredit you. You will lose your job, etc., right? If you are committed to human rights universally, and I mean universally, you will find yourself at odds with the U.S. government, and you will find yourself at odds with the American ruling class, right? And it's a very important lesson for young people, because you still have a conscience. They haven't quite beaten it out of you yet. You still have a commitment to truth. You're still on your path of seeking. You're not, just trying to legitimate yourself like us old folks. So I think Martin was still trying to find a way to retain his platform and still speak his heart, especially on international questions. And that meant rejecting American exceptionalism, which to his great credit, he did. And in part, I think that's why they had to murder him. There were a number of questions. I don't think we touched on everything, but
Well, the other thing is that there's the new book, relatively new, that came out on King. I think his name is Ng.
yeah.
He re-looked at some of the FBI files, and he found, I think it's Alex Haley, that Alex Haley, when King and Malcolm met once, is March 1965, and according to Haley's interpretation of that in Autobiography of Malcolm X, Haley says that King was disparaging of Malcolm, and then this Ng says that that's not what the files show. These are FBI files. That he says, Malcolm and I have more in common than people think. And so these are King's words. And so, and then look at King's socioeconomic perspective. In Coretta Scott King's My Life with Martin Luther King, she says that in 1968 or late 67, they're talking on the phone, and he says to her, we're asking for economic justice now. When we were talking about civil rights, we weren't asking for anything. But now we're asking for something, and so they're after me. This is a phone conversation that she writes about. So he's moving, he's a closet socialist who's coming out of the closet gradually. And his position on the Vietnam War is part of that. And he's pushed. I mean, he is pushed. The students are pushing him. And they're very influenced by Malcolm X. Malcolm X's influence on the students is very profound, and they talk about this later after he dies. The other thing I wanted to say was, I can't remember, something having to do with, and the interview that Malcolm gives in 1063, he talks about Palestine. 1963.
He writes about Palestine, meets with Palestinian authorities, and he writes about Palestine in 1964. It's a very important piece because he's making a connection between a Zionism and white supremacy. And he's making a connection between a Zionist project and global white supremacy and global capitalism, right? It's very complicated in African American political history because many African American leaders, anti-racists, anti-imperialists, right, even leftists, had initially sided with Israel, seeing Zionism as a kind of extension of the third world struggle for self-determination. What Malcolm understood by the 1960s, and this is before the 1967 war, he understood Israel as a creation of imperialism, right? As a creation of British imperialism, and he recognized the role that it was playing actually as a bastion of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, right? This later became clear in terms of Israel's ties to apartheid, et cetera, et cetera. But that was a really important insight in terms of transcending Cold War thought and transcending Cold War liberalism, right? Not that Malcolm was tied to Cold War liberalism. When I say Cold War liberalism is a kind of post-World War II compromise with the grassroots forces of revolt. And the compromise is this. It says, look, we are going to support in a very moderate version, in a very mild version, some degree of racial reform, okay? We're going to address it in terms of education. We're going to address it in terms of housing, employment, et cetera. In return, you keep your mouth shut about the international scene. You don't talk about Vietnam. You don't talk about the Congo, right? You do not resist. You do not contradict the State Department, right? And if you do, right, we're going to discredit you. We're going to ruin you. And perhaps, as has been already suggested, we're going to kill you, okay? This is what American empire does. And it's done it time and time and time again. Okay? This is partly what Malcolm meant when he said chickens coming home to roost. So now that we find ourselves facing neo-fascism, right? Now that people are getting kidnapped off the street, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, snatched off of our campuses, we have to ask ourselves, what is the prelude to this, right? What is the cost of our silence? Okay? What is the cost of our silence on Palestine? But also, what is the cost of our silence on the Sudan? And what is the cost of our silence on the Congo? And what is the cost of our silence with so many situations of oppression where U.S. militarism, where global capitalism, where the forces of extraction have destroyed people's lives, and we, right, here in the imperial core, are directly complicit. What have we done? Right? And I think that's part of Malcolm's legacy, an important part of Malcolm's legacy.
But I think also it's important for us to contextualize. There are many myths and misconceptions about Malcolm. So that's why you hear us, we say, look at the books like The Dead Are Rising. Malcolm X speaks.
Yeah, right.
Sit down and look at it and read the speeches for yourself to see what is happening. So, for instance, he talked about the question of what Malcolm said, are chickens coming home to roost? The question was, they were talking about assassination, and they were talking about assassination in Vietnam, and they talked about the role of the United States government in relation to that. But one of the other things that is not known is that there was a meeting, now I remember, I believe Abiy Davis was there, Malcolm, and they talked about the question of, prior to, in other words, what were they going to do? How were they going to advance the interests of what? Changing the status of black people in America. So look at the program of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Read what he said when he went abroad. And also one of the things I think is very important in regard to Malcolm X is for you to go out and find out, not what someone told you Malcolm said, but go and see what he said. not what someone else said. So a lot of times it says that words are taken out of context. But what Malcolm did was he made us to think. He said, you go examine it. You think it out. What are your interests? What are you doing to be able to change your interests? So the institution that we're sitting in today is a result of what? Struggle, so that we could sit here and have a dialogue around the question of what? What is our status? Why are we in this status? And what are we going to do to change the status that we're in?
Yeah.
So Professor Washington stepped out, but this dialogue has been very generative and thoughtful, and I think has covered so much ground. And it definitely poses a challenge to continue to think with and through the extraordinary life and legacy of Malcolm X. I mentioned in February that in so many ways he continues to be with us, and I think that that's at least a comfort in a world that is so confusing on so many levels right now, and where despair has become more widespread, but we're continuing to hold on to hope for change and to think about possibilities for transformation in ways that could be sustaining for far more people, for everyone, because that very much is what the beloved community is all about. And I think about what it means to be so genuine, so passionate in pursuing one's goals. There's that insight. And I think you said this at one point in your biography of Dr. Betty, that when Malcolm X passed away, he had a little over $600 in the bank. That right. And so she really was in a place where she had to think as a woman. And that was no small task in that time and moment, but how to move forward. And I appreciate your right. And you take us this biography, I'm serious when I say it's so gripping. You take us there to that very night when Attila writes a letter to her father, and it's like, we're right there. And in the days thereafter and the years thereafter, to think about what it was like for them. And then similarly, Dr. King literally donated his Nobel money. And so they were passionate about what they did and genuinely committed to their causes, and not in it, for profiteering or any of those kinds of motives. They weren't concerned about their brand, whatever that. And I'm not knocking, the idea of building a brand and all the idioms
I'm knocking it.
So, okay. Well, because it's kind of mapped as kind of the way to go, or people talk about becoming influencers and that sort of thing. So think about these men. They didn't really start out with that intention, and yet and still they've remained so influential over time. And so maybe we'll just get concluding
I think this
words.
gentleman had his hand up for quite a while.
Oh, sorry.
I guess, I was looking at the agenda or the introduction or whatever, and it says that his vision of the end of white world supremacy seems at odds with the reality that people see now. And I guess I would disagree and would like to hear what you think, because in my mind, it's exactly what's happened.
Yeah.
I mean, the West is on decline.
Yeah.
Asia's on the rise.
Yeah.
And I would say personally, as somebody who was born in this country, but who's, you know, my parents came from China, it's actually had a big impact on me from when
Yeah.
I remember being at Cornell in the early 70s and I felt so powerless or weak.
Yeah.
And now I see Cornell and it's so different.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't want to, you know, so, I mean, and a couple of other thoughts that went through my mind. And
Yeah.
You know, Mao, in a way, has had a complicated history.
Yeah.
But in a way, when you look at Mao and Malcolm, I think there's some similarity.
Yeah.
Mao believed in the subjective in a lot of ways. I mean, he was a scientific, so he believed, and maybe it was a mistake also, you know, Cultural Revolution and this and that. He believed in the subjective, and it seems like Malcolm did also. I mean, criticism, self-criticism, I don't know,
Yeah.
I could go on, but,
Yeah.
and the only other thing that I'm gonna throw in, and I don't know if you can, is when you look at Cornell, because, you know, actually, what I learned recently that's interesting is John Brown had some connection actually to Cornell, but what is never mentioned now, obviously, because now it's just, you know, but or maybe that's something to talk about later.
You mean the white radical?
John Brown, yeah, you know, the
Abolitionist.
abolitionist, but he was funded by Smith.
That's
For
right,
the-
he was. He was funded by the wealthy landowner, Garrett Smith.
Who, when Andrew White, I learned, came up with his one person, one study or whatever.
Yeah.
He wrote that to Smith. That was his letter to Smith.
Well,
But that's a separate
they
topic
were
in a
both
sense.
abolitionists. Andrew Dixon White was an abolitionist, and so was Garrett Smith. And Cornell was a quasi-abolitionist. But that was why Cornell, as a university, any person, any study, because that wasn't the case with the others. That wasn't the case with Harvard or King's College, as Columbia was called.
Can I just, as we wrap up, again, the title, The End of White World Supremacy. So Malcolm, more than any other African American figure of his generation, sort of exemplifies this hope and promise of a post-colonial world that was not going to simply be a change in administration, but was going to be a new sort of human epoch, was going to be a new sort of era of human rights, of self-determination, of equality. Now, you know, we know, right? We know that that's not the way it turned out. That's not the way the post-colonial world looks. But Malcolm was deeply invested in the promise of Bandung, right? The Bandung Conference of 1955, and the idea of a non-aligned world, and the idea of a self-determined Afro-Asian world. I agree with you. Part of when we say the chicken's coming home to roost in this moment is we're seeing the decline of the West. I mean, it's no longer just, you know, sort of wild-eyed leftists like myself. It should be clear to everybody that we're living through the decline of the West. And it's already gotten ugly, and I think it's going to get uglier. And not just for, obviously, for U.S. citizens, but for the world. I mean, a beast is most dangerous in their sort of death throes. Mm-hmm. Malcolm understood this. This kind of touches back to a question you asked, Rashay, early on. Was Malcolm too invested in, or perhaps even a bit naive about the United Nations as a forum where one could genuinely get justice, where you could seek redress and have an affirmation of the United States project as a genocidal project, genocidal certainly for indigenous people, genocidal for black folks? Was Malcolm perhaps too optimistic about the organization of African unity, the newborn OAU, as a true counterforce to Western imperialism? He himself already in '64, as he travels throughout Africa, sort of confronts you know, the limits of sort of African sovereignty and the problem of what he calls dollarism, which is really just kind of, you know, neoliberalism, economic control. Now that we're, you know, well into the sort of late decline of the West, late decline of American empire, what lessons can we learn, both from Malcolm's strengths and his insights and perhaps some of his miscalculations? I think that we are going to have to build a grassroots, transnational human rights struggle. And Malcolm was so important in terms of shifting the discourse and the thinking in the Black freedom struggle from a kind of domestic-oriented civil rights approach to a more internationalist human rights orientation. The truth is that India is on the rise, China, obviously, Brazil, many other nations. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to usher in the era of human rights and equality that we want, right? So we have to be always critical of ourselves and critical of any nation state. That's the thing. People say, you know, that somehow like criticizing Israel as a nation state is some kind of anomaly. We are critical of all nation states, right? All nation states are based on these mythologies. All nation states are based on these pathologies, on this chauvinism, etc. So we have to build an alternative vision of the future, and it has to come from below, but it has to be rooted in human rights. It has to be rooted in inequality. It has to be rooted in an expansive vision of human liberation that does not leave anybody out, right? And I think that is an important part of Malcolm's legacy at 100.
Could I also add to that that we haven't talked about militarism. We haven't talked about the fact that this is the most armed nation in the world. We've got more arms than China. We've got more arms than nuclear than Russia. And so if we don't have a struggle that addresses that issue, then China may have a more economic advantage, but the United States is so adjusted to being on top that you're talking about nuclear catastrophe before they would allow this to happen. I think that aside from the kind of struggle that we've been talking about in this moment, there also has to be a struggle about how to have less nuclear arms. We've got environmental problems. You know, we've got a whole slew of problems that are not even related to what we've been talking about. And how do you address those?
Yes.
Just to say that those three things, the militarism, the racism, and the materialism, or white supremacy, capitalism, and total global domination through the militarism, those three things, those three legs of the stool always work together. They don't work separately.
That's right. As King said.
Yes,
As King said, and Malcolm said.
And Dr. King also famously said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
That's right.
And those are the kinds of values that I think Malcolm X also embodied in his vision. People probably wouldn't
That's
have
true.
referred to it as the
Yeah.
beloved community, but I think that's what it was. Another thing
That's what it
important to
amounts
remember.
exactly.
Absolutely. Another important thing is that I think we have to think about, and it's interesting that, you know, come back to Dr. King, but the way that, and we're coming up to him too, God willing, 4 years from now, 100 men who passed away at 39,
That's
and
right.
now there's centennial commemorations are upon us. The thing with Dr. King in terms of understanding how he operated, one way to think about it is that he was a kind of intermediary. He could get in the rooms, and so he was talking to the governmental officials, like very directly, and brokering, like helping to broker certain legislation. You know, the outgrowth of those encounters was the at one level, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and so they were key to helping to bring about the transformations that we're increasingly feeling retrenchments against right now. What Malcolm X did that I think was very significant, even though he could have increasingly played a role like that, I think had he lived longer, was that he helped to translate and break down very complex concepts. He was almost his own public sphere, if that makes sense. I mean, he was that person who, if you were sitting in the room, takes us back to Dean Turner's experiences, and the experiences of so many others of her generation, along with Professor Turner's. If you were in the room, like listening to one of those speeches, it was like it was the news. You were informed about international affairs. He helped to build those literacies among his audiences, making these very complex kinds of intellectual dynamics and geopolitics very relatable and understandable for people who were not necessarily always very well educated. And so he never talked at them, he talked to them, and he helped them to understand what was going on and to become much more informed than they would have ordinarily been. And so that's, I think, another takeaway as far as how he was able to empower and uplift so many people. And that role that he played in the public sphere in the United States and globally, I think is crucially important. You know, he bridged that gap, so to speak. And he's been one of the most effective people ever, I think, in doing that. So that's another thing. But yes, Andrew.
I just want to add, when he suggested that when he was thinking of going to the United Nations, you mentioned that we're talking about nation states. But what has happened, and that is more visible now, is how empire has created the colonial proxies through the international organizations.
Yeah. Right.
And the role of the United Nations, I think you mentioned, in the Congo, when Lumumba, out of desperation, thought that the United Nations, of course, Dag Hammarskjöld lost his own life, but it didn't have any consequence. You see, so that was my question earlier. In his thought of the Afro-American unity, thinking that we need to think of those organizations beyond a nation state. And more recently, Gaddafi died because he was thinking of creating an alternative to the international financial systems of the
That's
International Monetary Fund, of the World Bank.
Yep.
And that's why the United States, France, and the UK, they came together to take him. So, pardon?
Under a black president.
He claimed that it was Hillary.
Which Hillary Clinton
Well,
crowed about.
You are the president.
Yeah.
You, Secretary of State, cannot tell you something and you believe. Anyway, so that's the important thing. He's thinking, well, we may go to the United Nations, but even more important, we create our own cross-national organization. That's the dimension that I wanted to mention.
I think we should probably move to conclude in the interest of time, but I appreciate that point. Very good point.
Absolutely. Yes, we had ordered pizza, but somehow it's never arrived. But still, we're pressing on. So there are some snacks available out in the lobby. Thanks to all of you who have come today. Many blessings to you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Many blessings to your families. And many blessings to the legacy of Malcolm X, eternally, and to his family and followers and friends on earth. Thank you all so much for just this
Peace to
outstanding
Malcolm,
dialogue.
and peace to
Thank
Malcolm's
you.
family.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for saying that was great.